What is tragedy? In this series of videos, we will be looking at tragedy from its origins in the ancient Greek world to its flourishing in the early modern period in England and France. And in this first video, we will be looking at the earliest definition of tragedy, which we find in Aristotle's Poetics. Tragedy had its origin and its first flourishing in ancient Greece, and was then taken up in classical Rome, notably by the dramatist and philosopher Seneca. In the Renaissance period, dramatists look back to their Greek and Roman predecessors in the composition of their own plays. In this sequence of short videos on tragedy, we will start by looking at some of the principal ideas which we find in tragedies across these periods. And having done that, we will concentrate play by play on some of the most outstanding examples of the genre. We will start with Aeschylus and Sophocles from ancient Greece, and then we will move on to the Renaissance and early modern period, to Shakespeare in England and to Racine in 17th century France. And we begin our thoughts about the principal elements of tragedy by considering the first definition of tragedy, which we find in Aristotle's treatise called the Poetics. Aristotle's Poetics is a short and somewhat frustrating text. It is probably, in the form that we now have it, not composed by Aristotle himself, but represents the notes taken by his pupils. And so at some key points in the argument there is obscurity, and ideas which we would really like Aristotle to have developed remain somewhat cryptic. Nevertheless, it has provided through the centuries the starting point for anyone who wants to think about the basic structure and principles of tragedy. So this is where we also will begin. For Aristotle, one of the key elements in tragedy is the fall of the protagonist from some elevated position. Now, I've used the word protagonist here, which simply means the first actor or principal actor, because if we use the word hero, that often has inappropriate connotations. We admire heroes, but we don't always admire the protagonists of tragedy. So perhaps we can stick to the word protagonist. The fall then of the protagonist from some elevated position in society. How does that come about? Well, says Aristotle, it results from what he calls hamartia, that's the Greek word. And we could translate hamartia as error, sin, crime, mistake. It's a major blunder. It's a mistake of great proportions. Now, sometimes people refer to this as a fatal flaw. The problem with that way of looking at tragedy is that fatal flaw seems to be a comment on a character's personality. But what Aristotle is talking about is not personality, but action. It's a decision. It's a bad mistake that someone makes. It may, of course, result from a particular aspect of their personality, but that's not quite what Aristotle seems to mean. What kind of protagonist is most suitable when we're constructing a tragic plot? Well, says Aristotle, we don't want someone who is preeminent for virtue. Why? Well, if the protagonist of a tragedy is eminently virtuous, then their fall, their destruction, would be merely shocking. An example of that perhaps is the figure of Cordelia in Shakespeare's King Lear, whose death has throughout the centuries shocked readers and audiences because of her virtue as the dutiful daughter, and because she doesn't seem to do anything that would justify the terrible death that befalls her. So, if the protagonist of tragedy is wholly virtuous, their fall would merely shock us. Let's look at the other extreme. Suppose the protagonist is someone who falls through their evil and depraved conduct. Well, that wouldn't really be tragic either, says Aristotle, because their downfall would be a just and appropriate punishment for their evil ways. So he's looking for a protagonist who is, as it were, in the middle between these two extremes. Not thoroughly virtuous, but not thoroughly wicked. In other words, probably someone rather like ourselves. And this person, quite like ourselves in respect of their virtue or lack of it, makes a terrible, tragic mistake. Hamartia. When we think about what Aristotle says about the effect of tragedy on an audience, we need to move back a step and look at what his teacher Plato said about the effects of drama. Because Plato banned poets from his ideal state in his dialogue called The Republic. Why did he do that? Plato is thinking about his guardians, that's the people who are being trained up to take a leading role in the government of the state. He thinks that his guardians should not take part in dramatic performances because the very act of impersonating someone would be a kind of corruption. After all, drama is intrinsically a kind of lie. Plato also feared that an audience watching a play might also be corrupted. In both cases, he is afraid that the actors and the audience would be induced to imitate what happens on stage. It's for this reason that Plato would not allow the performance of plays in his ideal state. Why then does Aristotle take a more positive view of drama and in particular of tragedy? And this leads us to ask about Aristotle's ideas on the effects of tragedy, the impact that tragedy makes on its audience. He says that the fall of the protagonist should arouse in the audience pity, and we feel pity, he says, for undeserved misfortune. Secondly, the fall should arouse fear. Fear, he says, for someone like ourselves. In both cases, this takes us back to his definition of the ideal protagonist being someone who is not wholly virtuous or wholly wicked. For such a person in the middle between total virtue and total depravity, for someone like ourselves then, we can feel pity and we can feel fear. We see ourselves making similar mistakes. Now, Aristotle then says that the pity and the fear that are aroused by a performance of tragedy, or even, he says, from the reading of tragedy, this pity and this fear is purged through what he calls catharsis. Now, this is one of the annoying points at which the text of the Poetics is irritatingly obscure, because he doesn't explain quite what he means by catharsis. The Greek word means purging. It's basically a medical term. And it's likely that what Aristotle thinks happens at the end of tragedy is that as our pity and our fear are stirred up, they are in a sense then reduced to the appropriate level, or there is a kind of balance established. In other words, tragedy seems to create a final harmony within the person who observes it. And that is very much the opposite view to what we found in Plato. Plato is afraid that the audience will be corrupted by drama. Aristotle thinks that the audience is likely to be restored to a kind of wholeness by what they are witnessing. Finally, let us think about two of the key elements which Aristotle identifies as being important to the structure of tragedy: recognition and reversal. The first of these, anagnorisis, recognition, requires that the tragic protagonist should eventually recognize the true nature of what they have done, recognize the true character of their earlier mistake. It may be that that mistake was made through ignorance, through willfulness, through self-deception, whatever it may be. Eventually, the protagonist comes to realize that the decision was indeed an error. And sometimes that happens through the protagonist recognizing the true identity of another character. The other structural feature is peripeteia, reversal. It may be that a character has pursued a particular line of action in the belief that it will bring him or her good, and at the end of the play they recognize that what they have brought about is the reverse of what they intended. Now, Aristotle offers us the example of Sophocles' Oedipus the King, Oedipus Rex, as an example of how effective recognition and reversal are in tragedy, and particularly, he says, when they occur simultaneously. So let's just think about what happens in that play in order to illustrate Aristotle's idea. Oedipus has visited an oracle which has told him that he is fated to kill his father and marry his mother. Horrified at that, he decides not to return to Corinth, where his parents live, and he sets off in another direction. He arrives at Thebes, solves the riddle of the Sphinx, which has been terrorizing the city, and is rewarded with marriage to the queen. On his way, he has an encounter with an old man in a chariot surrounded by servants. Oedipus is forced off the road, it seems, and in retaliation strikes out and kills the old man. Eventually, and this is what happens in Sophocles' play, Oedipus comes to realize that the man he killed, while ignorant of his identity, was his own father, and the woman he has married while ignorant of her identity, is his own mother, because the people he thought were his parents back in Corinth had simply adopted him. We can see how important these recognitions are to the tragedy, and we can see how recognition and reversal occur simultaneously in this case, because there is a reversal of his understanding, a complete transformation of his knowledge of the relationships that pertained in the course of his life. It's the recognition and the reversal that are truly tragic. They are the key elements, really, of this play. So this has been a short excursion through some of Aristotle's principal ideas about tragedy, and from this we move on in the next video to consider some other basic ideas that recur in tragedy from several different periods. Here are some suggestions for translations of Aristotle's Poetics, each of which has a good introduction and annotation, and these will be useful to you if you want to explore Aristotle's ideas further.